Morning, everyone, and welcome to this ILR summer session of Adventures in Living. The kickoff is a little different this year, and I'm terribly sorry not to be with you in person in the Oak Room, but COVID has upset the apple cart yet one more time. So great thanks, as always, to Julianne for the Zoom link, and to my fellow facilitators, Dick Martin for his technical skill, and Diane Haynes for her wide-ranging contacts and organizational groundwork in these presentations. They're both just great co-facilitators and to be commended. We're beginning Adventures in Living this year with a walk down memory lane, the tropics and a few other hotspots, a video of Margaret Boonstra from July 2014. Many of you knew Margaret, a vibrant member of Okanuk, who died recently in April. Margaret was an immediate and close friend and neighbor to my husband Robert and me when we moved into our house here in 2020. She welcomed us and introduced us to so many wonderful people. Margaret was the chairman of the ILR Humanities Curriculum Committee and is the reason I'm on the Humanities Curriculum Committee today. As many of you know, you never said no to Margaret. Roy Hunt, longtime friend of Margaret's, is here to introduce the video, and Margaret's wonderful daughter, Tara, who lives here in Gainesville and is an attorney for the UF Foundation, is here as a special guest to answer any questions after the video. Roy, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, as Debbie mentioned, some of you heard the Margaret's presentation in person a number of years ago. I think it's probably the most popular one we ever have sponsored. And so the decision of ILR was to repeat that. It seemed appropriate. I was asked to present, I suppose, because Margaret described me as her oldest living friend. I was co-chairing a program in San Jose, Costa Rica in 1968 for the Florida Bar International Law Section. And we went to one of our first tasks was to go to the U.S. Embassy, and we met with Margaret's husband, Tara's father, and by chance, another member of the staff there was married to a Gainesville girl, to Dr. and Mrs. Murphy's daughter, Kay. And that's probably why we got such wonderful treatment. But in any event, the Boonstras offered to host a cocktail supper for the Florida Bar International Law Section at the embassy residence in San Jose. When our bus pulled up, we were astonished to learn that we were entering Tara for Gone with the Wind. A wealthy businessman in San Jose had a wife who was enamored of all things Gone with the Wind. And so he had built Tara there in San Jose for her. Shortly after it was completed, she died, and he did not want to live in the house, and he leased it to the U.S. government as an embassy residence. So Tara here was about 3 months old when we arrived at that party. It was a beautiful evening. You can imagine Margaret was the consummate hostess, welcomed everyone. And I thought this was great, never dreamed I would see them again. But when Claire retired and they were seeking a retirement home, they stopped off to visit the Roundtrees here in Gainesville. Bill had been ambassador to Brazil, and Claire had served under him there. And the Boonstras never went any further. Margaret and I shared a birthday, not the same year. She's always clear that I was a little older than she. But over the years, we often had joint birthday parties. And I know that this year, when that date arrives, it will be sad because we did share one last year. But I am so thankful that Dick Martin taped this. It's really like a visit with Margaret. And so with that, I'll stop. Let me say that afterwards, Tara would be happy to answer any questions. She may have something else she wants to share with you.
Well, as I've thought about which adventures in my life might be of interest to you, and have pored over photo albums and read old letters and pulled memories out of the back of my brain, I have realized once again that my experiences have been amazing, and that I've been the luckiest person imaginable. Thus, I am very grateful to have been asked to make this presentation and relive some of the highlights of my life in the tropics and a few other hotspots too. I panned for gold in Panamanian jungles so dense the path had to be chopped down with a machete in front of us. In Costa Rica, I kept my daughter and our dog from front porch encounters with poisonous frogs the size of baseballs. I helped milk poisonous snakes being raised to produce anti-venom for our troops in Vietnam. I hugged the gleeful recipients of sewing machines I delivered to a leper colony outside of Rio de Janeiro. I trekked all over Machu Picchu and the Great Wall, the latter with Bill and Elsa Fox, who are sitting there in the back. I've marveled at the three most majestic waterfalls of the earth, Niagara, Iguazu, and Victoria, and floated over Turkey in a hot air balloon at age 75. I attended Pelé's last game in Maracanã Stadium. I was awed by the Kremlin and by Robben Island, which was Nelson Mandela's jail for 28 years. I swam in a Mediterranean grotto built by Antony for Cleopatra and scaled the Roman Forum walls for a midnight tryst and wine tasting. I was transfixed at performances by Edith Piaf singing in Paris and Rudolf Nureyev dancing in Brazil. Little did I imagine any of these experiences while growing up in then beautiful Gary, Indiana, on the sandy shores of Lake Michigan. Gary was founded by U.S. Steel, of course, and my Dutch immigrant grandfather established the first jewelry store there around 1905. We were an hour from Chicago, where my father worked, where we had many relatives, and where we often went for cultural presentations by world-renowned artists. My classmates were an eclectic lot whose families came for work in or connected to the mills. We still enjoy reunions 74 years after many of us entered kindergarten together. Thanks to my family, I was born with the travel bug. And by the time I entered college, I had visited 45 of the 48 states in the continental United States with my brother, sister, and brave parents. I also evinced an early interest in government. In 8th grade, I was thrilled to be accepted as a page in the Indiana State Legislature. Later, I was sent to Girls State. And as you Republicans and Democrats alike, Ed Goebel especially, will be surprised to hear, I was a dedicated Hoosierette for Ike. You can see my scarf I've saved all these years. Indulging my interest in civic affairs, My dad took me to whistle stops made by Harry Truman and Thomas E. Dewey, and to Washington, D.C., where in simpler days I was able to visit the office of my idol, Senator Margaret Chase Smith. Although she was out when we stopped in, here's a picture of the photo and letter she sent me soon thereafter. It had always been assumed that when the time came for college, I would follow my parents' footsteps to Indiana University. However, instead, I took the first of many unusual paths and went east to school where I knew no one and entered Smith College, a journey with repercussions to this day. As Barbara said, I majored in government, of course. And after my junior year there, I made a life-saving trek through Europe with 3 classmates and a tiny car, and came back determined to join the Foreign Service, especially after reading the book, The Ugly American. Like so many my age, our ages, I was determined to show the world that we Americans were a caring, respectful people. Thus I took and somehow passed the grueling Foreign Service written and oral exams, and then after graduation waited impatiently to be appointed. I moved to Washington and joined 2 others living on the 2nd floor of a 3-story Georgetown home, which recently sold for $9 million. While I waited, I put on my white gloves, washed nightly, and high-heeled pumps and nylons, took a civil service typing test, and in 3 days found a great job at the Justice Department, where I became a top-level secretary during what turned out to be a very intensely interesting time. My boss, a federal judge, American ambassador, and then a lifelong friend, was head of the Office of Legal Counsel and of the Criminal Division, and he directed work on the integration of Little Rock, the admission of Alaska and Hawaii into the Union, and the trial of Jimmy Hoffa, all of which I worked on. I often fielded calls to the White House and forged the Attorney General's signature on documents appointing federal judges and U.S. attorneys. My most frequent date was Peg Natras's congressman, who later became president of NYU. Thanks to my boss and the congressman, I sat in the Senate balcony the raucous night when Alaska gained statehood, and in the jammed House of Representatives when President Eisenhower delivered a State of the Union address. I partied at the Jockey Club, the Anderson House, the Organization of American States, and the Mayflower Hotel, smooched in the U.S. Capitol parking lot, and bantered with such luminaries as F. Scott Fitzgerald's daughter, Lady Bird Johnson's future press secretary Liz Carpenter, Attorney General and future Secretary of State William P. Rogers, and Helen Thomas, the long-lived White House correspondent. Those were heady times for a 23-year-old. Lest you think it was all glamour, though, I should add that when I first began at Justice, I was so broke that I took a second job, selling encyclopedias door to door, 3 nights a week. Although I was successful, I detested it. And as soon as I'd accumulated enough money to buy a winter coat, I quit. Finally, after 3 engrossing years at Justice, my State Department appointment came through, and I was sworn in as a Foreign Service officer. Here is the certificate appointing me, signed by President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Christian Herter. I'm sorry it's not a little more clear, but I think you can see it's still pretty impressive. I thought it was great. People beginning a career as a Foreign Service officer enter the State Department as a class. In my class of 20, I was the only woman. I loved it, needless to say. The other woman in the photo is the secretary to the director of our group. After 6 months of intensive training at the Foreign Service Institute in State Department operations, consular work, and Spanish from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. with just one other student, I boarded a Pan Canal ship called the Ancon, and I was ready for the 5-day trip to Panama. It was January 1961. My Georgetown neighbor, 3 doors away, John F. Kennedy, was shortly to be inaugurated as president, and I was ready for two of the most exciting years of my life. This past spring, I attended a 3-day conference at UF on Panama, and I want to share some of the excellent presentations with you. So I will come back to Panama after I briefly tell you about my tour there and a bit about the rest of my life before moving to Gainesville in 1975. I will say now, though, that I was assigned as vice consul in charge of granting or denying immigrant visas. Two historical events made my tour unique. One, Panama declared in the 50s, late 50s, that all schools in Panama and the zone must teach in Spanish. That had little effect in Panama itself, where Spanish was always the language of the schools. But in the zone, it was devastating to the descendants of the West Indians who had come from British-speaking Caribbean islands to construct the railroads and/or the canals. They didn't speak Spanish. They still had British passports and felt loyalty mostly to the United States. They felt as if they belonged to no country, really. So they came in droves to obtain visas to begin new lives in North America. I was very sympathetic to their aspirations and was in fact honored for my assistance to them. The second historical occurrence was the result of the takeover by Fidel of Cuba. He'd come into power just 18 months before I arrived in Panama, and by that time, with his true colors showing, Cubans were fleeing as fast as they could. Our embassy in Panama City was one of the places where they could obtain visas to go to the United States, so we were inundated. One day, as the Cubans crowded into our reception room, we listened together in horrified silence as the news of the Bay of Pigs came over the radio. I will never forget that horrible experience, and I thought of it reverently as I visited the scene of that debacle on a poignant tour of Cuba 2 years ago. Besides my consular work, and because embassy higher-ups could see my interest in everything and knew of my ability to communicate well in Spanish, I was also asked to establish relationships with students at the sometimes volatile University of Panama, which I happily and successfully did. I also traveled all over the country, learned the beautiful Panamanian dances well enough to appear on TV, acted in a play, served as publicity director for the National Museum of Panama, and through my future husband's ties, was allowed to take part in an amphibious landing and 24-hour trek at the Jungle Warfare Training Center in the Canal Zone. My friend and I were the first women ever allowed to participate. Here we are eating a welcome meal on a plate made from a banana leaf. One of the most amusing outcomes of my 2 years in Panama is shown in this photo. And if you're interested afterward, you can come up and see up close the originals over there, because this doesn't come through too well on the screen. For 2 months, I was the lead character in the comic strip I'm sure many of you will remember, Brenda Starr. Brenda's creator, Dale Messick, had been a friend of my mother since they were infants. My mother had traveled extensively, but Dale, despite writing convincingly of Basil St. John, tried to locate a black orchid in the jungles, had never been outside the U.S. So Mom and Dale came to visit me, and we introduced Dale to the tropics. I was known as Margie B. Shore then. So when Brenda visited Maggie Shore, vice consul in Panama, every friend I'd ever had recognized me. My family was tickled that in one of the strips, Dale pictured my mother, brother, sister, Dale herself, and her husband, but really ticked off one of her most avid fans, my father, who was not pictured. Also not depicted in Dale's strip was our most hilarious escapade. My mother, Dale, and I drove to Panama's interior to a fiesta. Unwisely, I had failed to make lodging reservations in this small town, and there wasn't a single room to be had when night came. Finally, we were offered 3 sofas in the lobby of a simple hotel where newspapers, appropriately for Dale, served as our blankets. Only in the morning did we find out that the hotel usually housed the local brothel. Well, I mentioned my future husband, and that story begins during those same 2 fateful years and continues through most of the later adventures I'll tell you about. One night in Panama, across a crowded room, at a reception in the ambassador's residence, I met Claire Boonstra, the man who would become my husband 5 years hence. He was a widower with children aged 9 and 12 and was a high-ranking State Department official assigned as the first political advisor to the Commander-in-Chief of the Southern Command. He lived at Quarry Heights, a lovely U.S. military post in the Canal Zone, and I lived in bustling Panama City. Our romance so paralleled that of Emile de Beck and Nellie Forbush in South Pacific that the music caused our hearts to flutter for the rest of our lives together and keeps mine fluttering still. One of the most memorable of our many dates was a New Year's Eve party at an admiral's home where the guest of honor was the captain of Her Majesty's yacht, the Britannia. Needless to say, we all accepted the captain's invitation to tour the Britannia the next day. Here I am before we boarded. The yacht was spotless, but amusingly British, with big flowered chintz furniture all over. We had a wonderful time, though, before the ship sailed southward to a rendezvous with the Queen during her South American visit. Too soon, the 2-year tours of my husband and I came to a close, and we followed our heads, not our hearts, as he went off to Mexico as the Deputy Chief of Mission, while I flew to Washington on loan to the fledgling Peace Corps. Sergeant Shriver himself interviewed and okayed me for a job as the program officer for Brazil, Bolivia, and Uruguay. And I have to interject here that Sergeant Shriver was the most charismatic person I've ever met. He was unfailingly enthusiastic, fun, hardworking, inspiring, dedicated, and effective. Volunteers and staff worshiped him, and he claimed our esteem his entire life. As program officer in the Latin American Division of the Peace Corps, I backed up our overseas staffs, traveled all over the U.S. and Puerto Rico to visit sites where volunteers were being trained, to Brazil to better understand the work of that some of our volunteers were doing there, and to Bolivia, where for a month I was director of the entire Peace Corps program there. I flew in a DC-3 transport with baby chicks escaping up and down the aisles. Let's see. Dined with volunteers who lived so high up in the Altiplano, it took 30 minutes to boil a cup of water for a cup of coffee, and I slogged through enough jungles to last for a lifetime. I also participated in meetings in Washington with Peace Corps staff, including many chaired by the incredible, capable young Bill Moyers, who was Shriver's phenomenal deputy even before Moyers' 30th birthday. I salute Mary Kilgore and Sally Foote of Oak Hammock for their service as some of the first Peace Corps volunteers at this time. There may be others at Oak Hammock, but I'd love to become aware of them if there are. My immediate boss was Jack Vaughn, who became my mentor and lifelong friend until he died 2 years ago. I actually attended his interment in Arlington National Cemetery. When LBJ named Jack as Assistant Secretary of State for American Republic Affairs, I left the wild and wonderful Peace Corps and moved across town to the much more staid Department of State as one of Jack's 3 staff assistants. The Alliance for Progress had recently been launched, and we worked feverishly with high hopes that it would succeed. During that time, the U.S. also invaded the Dominican Republic to assist in its transition to democracy. I inherited the unenviable task of arriving at work at 7 a.m. to immediately prepare a timeline of the contacts with other Latin American governments of the previous day, trying to prove that we consulted with and were supported by them. This timeline went directly to LBJ and was used by him all day, each day, for about a week. I've never in my life had to be quite as creative as I was when I put that timeline together. In 1966, President Johnson asked Schreiber to head up the poverty program, and he tapped Jack as the second head of the Peace Corps. At Jack's request, I returned to the Peace Corps with him as his director of talent search. My assignment was to seek out and vet candidates for our overseas staff. One of the Peace Corps' strongest supporters had always been the wonderful Hubert Humphrey, and I was very honored when I received this letter from him and later chatted with him at the White House. Jack and his supporters were thrilled by his return to the Peace Corps, especially because that meant we didn't have to deal anymore with Bobby Kennedy, who, although he knew nothing about Latin America, was determined to mastermind our efforts there and demolish anyone who tried to educate him. Both my husband and Jack had had the misfortune of dealing with him, and forever afterwards detested this mean-spirited Kennedy, who was so unlike his brothers and brother-in-law. I can't neglect to mention two seminal events which took place during my Washington days. One was Martin Luther King's March on Washington. Although at the time I frankly didn't understand the full incredible import of that march, I left my office that day and walked to the mall in a sea of whites and blacks, everyone hopeful and peaceful, very similar to my trek at the first inauguration of Barack Obama. I'm proud and feel amazingly lucky to have attended both such historical events. And when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, I was there again. I heard the horrible news at a Peace Corps recruiting desk at a university in Pittsburgh, and in shock, flew back immediately to my townhouse apartment 6 blocks from the Capitol. My roommate and I, like everyone else, were glued to the TV, but we slept a few hours and set our alarm for 4 a.m. We got up, put on the warmest clothes we could find, and walked a block to join a 6-deep line solemnly inching up to the Capitol and to the bier where we could pay our respects. We entered the Capitol as the sun rose, but our souls have been forever darkened by that experience. On a much happier note, in 1966, my husband and I finally married. Believe it or not, LBJ himself had unknowingly derailed previously set wedding dates, but that prohibited by moves that prohibited my husband from leaving Mexico City. So when we at last tied the knot, it was on rather short notice before Foreign Affairs could intervene again. I was also determined to end my husband's foreign affairs. He was a very eligible bachelor there, and he'd been dating up a storm, including often escorting Lupe Rivera, daughter of Diego Rivera, the famed muralist, and Amalia Hernandez, the founder of Mexico's well-known Ballet Folklorico. On the Monday before our Saturday wedding, however, LBJ again managed to influence our lives. He signed the papers nominating Claire as ambassador to Costa Rica. We were elated, of course, although I felt deprived in that it meant I'd only get to live in Mexico for 6 months. These months were eventful, however. On a personal note, Claire and I and his 2 children, who I considered mine too after 5 years of dating, spent our first Christmas together as a married family. This photo was taken on our Mexico City patio. Secondly, with Claire serving as charge d'affaires during the absence of the ambassador, he and I were delighted to officially represent the United States at the then world-famous Acapulco Film Festival. The big film debut at the festival was Dr. Zhivago, but for Claire and me, the highlights were his dinner partner, Gina Lollobrigida. I was seated with Tab Hunter, which wasn't nearly so exciting. And our appearance on Bob Hope's television special, which covered the festival. Here we are with Merle Oberon and her husband, who lived in Acapulco and were the unofficial hosts of all the Hollywood luminaries. Needless to say, we floored and impressed all of our relatives and friends across the U.S. as Bob Hope introduced us on national TV. In our eyes, LBJ redeemed himself a number of times in the future for messing with our lives, but at no time were we more gratified than by his words to Claire in the Oval Office conversation this photo commemorates. As he told Claire he would indeed nominate him as ambassador, he said, "It is such a pleasure to nominate a man solely on the basis of merit. No money involved, no political influence, just merit." That was rare praise indeed. As we packed up in Mexico and celebrations of farewell ended with a rousing mariachi serenade at the airport, Claire and I flew to Washington for final briefings. In high spirits, I joined 6 other ambassadors' wives for tea with Lady Bird Johnson, one of the most gracious ladies I have ever met. In anticipation of the occasion, I had spent hours in a Mexico City beauty salon having my first and only fake fingernails affixed. I was sitting across from Lady Bird, as prim and proper as I could be, holding my teacup daintily with my little finger raised, when I realized with horror that one of those nails had fallen off. I frantically and furtively searched for it to no avail. So all I could do was give silent thanks that we were in the red room and the carpet was oriental and mostly red too, and that until the vacuum sweeper scooped up trash that night, the offending nail would probably go undetected. Several days after this near fiasco, Claire was sworn in an impressive ceremony at the State Department, presided over by Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and we were off to San Jose, where we spent 2.5 idyllic years. Highlights, besides the joyous birth of our first daughter, were LBJ's visit to Costa Rica, for which we received much-needed new bathroom plumbing to accommodate him if he stayed overnight. He didn't, but it was a big redemption. And accompanying the wonderful Costa Rican president to Washington for a state visit. We were among just 12 people invited to the Johnsons' private quarters for the exchange of gifts between presidents, and descended the staircase to the thrilling sounds of Hail to the Chief, just behind Secretary McNamara. My husband is right behind LBJ, just to the left of his head, and I'm to the left of my husband. I promise you I was there. It was another enchanted evening in our lives, but early the next morning brought the shocking news that Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. The state visit was cut short, and I flew off the South Lawn with Costa Rica's president in LBJ's helicopter, bound for Andrews Air Force Base, and then on to Miami and back to San Jose. We would have loved to have stayed 4 years in Costa Rica, and they would love to have had us. But you will recognize all too well what prevented this. Nixon was elected president, and when Claire submitted his resignation, as all presidential appointees must do after an election, it was accepted, and Nixon appointed a big donor to succeed Claire. In more innocent times, this caused a scandal in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the nomination had to be withdrawn. But by that time, we were long gone. This photo shows our beautiful home in Costa Rica, which was built by a Costa Rican who had seen the movie Gone with the Wind. And in honor of this, we named our first daughter Tara. Here I am, very pregnant with Tara, visiting an orphanage that the embassy wives helped. And then the next picture shows me, I think I'd had the baby by then, yes, presenting a check to the Children's Hospital there, the result of a wonderful big fair that we had held there. While my husband handled work at the office, I was, besides raising funds and doing these other things, I was expected to run our large home, encourage high morale among the Americans assigned to San Jose, engage with as many Costa Ricans and other diplomats as possible, entertain residents and visitors alike. One of the visitors we entertained all those years ago was Roy Hunt, Jane McClynn's brother and an Oak Hammock director, where he was a delegate to the Florida Bar Association's meeting there. We were surprised and delighted to meet him for the second time here in Gainesville and have valued his friendship ever since. Deposed career ambassadors are often assigned as faculty at universities, and when the University of Colorado was offered as one of our choices, we took it. During a very pleasant academic year there, we were thrilled when our second daughter was born. I was relieved to have an excuse not to ski, nor to attend the anti-Vietnam rallies, which Claire bravely frequented. By then, we agreed with the students, but as representatives of the U.S. government, Claire could not speak in opposition. Taking care of a baby and a 2.5-year-old with no household help or friends or relatives was quite a switch from managing and being supported by a staff of 10, as we had been in San Jose. But if one can't be flexible, one shouldn't be in the Foreign Service. And then another transition was about to come. In 1970, Brazil was in turmoil as a number of its citizens became active in a movement to oust the rather benign military dictatorship which had rescued the country from chaos in 1964. The American ambassador to Brazil was among the diplomats kidnapped by the rebels in hopes of raising ransom money to support their cause. Our ambassador was released without harm, but a replacement was needed ASAP. And Claire, who had served in Brazil in the 50s and knew it well from subsequent hemispheric assignments, was sent as chargé d'affaires. He immediately established our embassy in Brasilia, the first embassy to make the move they all had to make eventually, and we settled in Rio. As we surveyed this gorgeous city from the balcony of our 5-story house, our first call came in. It was to tell us that the German ambassador had been kidnapped. During the 4 years we lived in Rio, Claire traveled in a bulletproof car with an armed, tough chauffeur and an armed, dashing, utterly reliable bodyguard. In front of that car was one more with 4 armed guards, and behind followed another one with an equal contingent. This was my daughter's escort to preschool every day, and the guards at our house were my children's constant playmates. Nowadays, sadly, such situations are relatively common for Foreign Service personnel, and businessmen and women too, and representatives of international agencies. But at that time, we were unenthused pioneers. A dear friend of ours, our ambassador to Guatemala, had been gunned down trying to evade kidnappers, and an aid officer in Uruguay had been murdered and dumped on a street, and a man I dated had been killed in Italy. But these tragedies were still relatively rare. Nevertheless, Claire and I had a grim pact that if he were to be kidnapped, no ransom would be paid, despite the consequences, because that would encourage even more kidnapping. And we determined, too, that we would not give in and let these threats dictate our lives. Thus, we often slipped out of town in our own car with Claire driving and no guards, and sought wonderful solace in a little boat with which we plied the tiny island south of Rio with our 2 little girls. We also had many marvelous experiences in Rio itself. I swam in our pool with the brilliant and gracious William Buckley. shepherded a bubbling Liza Minnelli to our carnival party, lunched with awesome Werner von Braun, Elmo Zumwalt, and Jonas Salk, entertained dashing astronauts Deke Slayton and Jim Lovell, welcomed the serious CEOs of GE, Westinghouse, and U.S. Steel, and innumerable congressmen, senators, and Governor Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn. We also greeted musicians such as Duke Ellington, Andre Watts, Richie Havens, and Ella Fitzgerald. One of my favorite guests was James Michener, who of course wrote the book on which Claire's and My Beloved South Pacific was based. And imagine my glee when he took our album with him to Belo Horizonte, where he went to visit his old friend Mary Martin, who was living there. And he brought back the album with her autograph on it too. A year or so later, I was delighted to visit her there myself, where she had established a charming beauty salon and boutique. As in Costa Rica, I was expected to participate in many fundraising efforts for worthy causes. As in Gainesville, many revolved around lunches. And this photo depicts one in which our embassy was asked to send someone dressed in the national costume of our country. We sent my two daughters dressed in pioneer costumes we designed and sewed. As you can see, they were a big hit. This picture depicts another of my fundraising endeavors. Brazil's art scene was and is vibrant. Our home showcases art from all over the world, especially Latin America, but no painting is as illustrious as this one. My husband and I purchased it from the beautiful artist whose works often reflected her childhood in Manaus on the Amazon River. One day I attended a meeting of a group of about 8 American women whose husbands worked in Brazil, and we explored ways to raise funds for the Escola Americana, an elementary school serving underprivileged children. I recall that in Costa Rica, a similar group had raised money for a community center there by producing and selling greeting cards depicting the works of well-known Costa Rican artists. When everyone in Rio enthused about such a project, I raced home, brought back my rather large painting of the religious procession on the Amazon, and was thrilled when my friends immediately decided that it would serve as our first card. We produced a number of other cards over the years, but this very first card has the record. We sold 55,000 copies of it. Among the many groups visiting the Consulate General in Rio was the choir of my alma mater, Smith. It is also the alma mater of Suzanne Roundtree, whom many of you know. At that time, her husband was ambassador to Brazil, so she and I decided to showcase our school spirit. Here we are with other Smith alumni that night. I'm the one in hot pants. Some of you may remember that short-lived fashion craze. Another fashion craze, and far more lasting, I inaugurated in Costa Rica some years earlier. Here is a photo of a guest at our home seeing her hostess for the very first time sporting long pants at an evening event. It was actually such a daring move that beforehand I phoned 3 other women to beg them to wear long pants too. Here is another picture of Suzanne and me as we flanked the Swiss ambassador to Brazil. Soon after this photo was taken, he became yet another of the ambassadors who was kidnapped. The smaller embassies did not have the guards and procedures in place to avert kidnappings, so they were the rebels' victims when the elaborate protective elements of the Americans, the British, and the French foiled them. Fortunately, there were no deaths. And fortunately, there were many more happy highlights of our stay in Rio. Among them was one of the 4 annual carnival parades we attended. As usual, we went to see the parade and were accompanied by our normal contingent of 6 or so bodyguards. We'd watch the fantastic show all night, and as the sun began to rise and the crowd thinned, I could stand it no longer. I slipped away from my husband and the guards, climbed down the steps of the viewing stands to the street, and joined the samba group passing by. I danced with them for about a city block and still remember how ecstatic I was to achieve my dream, to samba on the avenue. Brazil is mesmerizing, so it was with tremendous regret that we departed after 4 years and my husband retired after an amazing career. But it was time to transition to a calmer life for us and our little daughters, and we chose Gainesville, a small town with an intellectual international population, near water and warm, and we never regretted our decision. Living stateside once again, I dove into activities that were impossible overseas, playing a role in elections and good government, and assisting students as they navigated the K through 12 years and then went on to college. I've written letters to the editor and to a number of presidents, have picketed numerous times, raised tons of money for campaigns, walked door to door, and tried to educate voters on issues and candidates. In education, I've read to little ones, shepherded about 35 young women to Smith, headed up the county school advisory committee, and for years ran a service advising the college bound. I'm still involved with most of these activities today. One of the primary attractions of Gainesville was and is the university, of course. And while we have never been employed at UF, my husband and I have from the beginning been involved with the Center for Latin American Studies. Thus it was that I found myself this spring at their conference on Panama during the celebration of the 100th year of the opening of the canal and on the eve of the opening of new, wider, and deeper locks under sole Panamanian control. There are probably many at Okamuk who have lived on military bases in the zone or who have transited the canal with understandable awe. Panama is a unique place and always has been, ever since the days that gold was shipped up from Peru, hauled across the isthmus through forbidding jungles, and loaded again onto ships waiting in an Atlantic port to carry it to Spain. In the 1960s, when I was there, it was probably one of the most diverse places on earth. There were pure-blooded white Catholics descended from the Spanish. There were Chinese whose ancestors had come to work for the French in the 19th century and later became shop owners. There were descendants of African blacks who had come as slaves a century before. There were West Indian blacks who arrived freely to help construct the railroad and the canal when no laborers from other areas were suitable. There were Jews descended from those who fled the Spanish Inquisition. There were mostly white North Americans whose families came to construct and run the canal, and U.S. military assigned there to protect the canal, as well as serve the rest of Latin America. There were many native Indians, such as the San Blas and Choclo. My vest was made by the San Blas Indians, by the way, and that's why I have it on today. It's the mola fabric work that they are famous for. Except for the San Blas and Choclo, and to a large extent the Jews and pure Spanish, everyone had intermarried. As I discovered in my visa work, there are at least 20 words in Spanish to designate one's skin color. Despite attempts in the 40s and 50s to appeal to nationalism, the country did not boast much national pride, and the fact of the canal overrode everything. After all, the U.S. had masterminded Panama's breaking away from Colombia, along with securing the rights in perpetuity to 10 miles across an area which bisected the country at its most populous point. But ever since 1964, when Panamanians rioted against the United States, and then after Noriega was removed by U.S. troops in 1990, and finally after Jimmy Carter's successful push to turn over the zone and the canal in 1999 to Panama, a consensus and pride have been building. No wonder, while problems of income disparity, corruption, and a need for better education and further refinement of the legal system persist, Panama has much to crow about. Defying all the naysayers, the canal is not only more profitable than it was under U.S. control, it also boasts a better safety record. The new canal locks are 80% complete and will open in 2015. The economy is growing at 10% a year and wages are the highest in Latin America. Over 100 banks, not just storefronts, but real buildings, have located there. And just since 2011, 28 global hotels have opened. Retirees are pouring in, settling in the interior and in Panama City. Ecotourism will soon exceed Costa Rica's. Panama, I've got several pictures here of the canal. It's difficult to see, but you can see the old, the two canals beside each other. It's very hard to tell. I looked for the best pictures I could find, but they were not very good. But anyway, I can assure you we did see pictures of how amazing it's going to be with these other locks right beside, at both ends of the canal. So Panama has been transformed in the last 10 years. The splintered populace, which I saw so clearly in the 60s, is now melded into a whole. Learning about this welcome transition during this conference has given me a feeling of closure. Panama sort of bookends my deepest involvement in foreign affairs. As the years go by and take their toll on my ability to roam far and wide, my previous experiences make it possible to understand and interpret what I now can only read about or see on TV or in a movie. And even more than I was able to in my early years, I can now put things into context, in perspective. This is very satisfying. We traveled widely after my husband's retirement to Morocco, the Soviet Union, Europe, and China, for instance. And Claire even lectured on a number of cruise ships touring Latin America. That's when this photo was taken. Since Claire's death 8 years ago, I've joined Smith College trips to South Africa, Turkey, and Cuba. So my interest in the world has not abated. But I think my future journeys will be less ambitious, yet no less satisfying. I have led an absolutely fabulous life. I've been the luckiest person imaginable. I've had the enormous honor to serve in the Justice and State Departments and the Peace Corps with colleagues who were brilliant and honest and adventurous and courageous and selfless and dedicated and idealistic. I had the amazing fortune to be married to my own Emile de Beck for 40 years and create a loving family of 4 children and their spouses and 7 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Here are most of them at my 75th birthday. Missing from our core group are my 2 nephews, my brother and his wife, and 1 granddaughter. And I now have a wonderful family as well here at Oak Hammock. As I close, I wish to thank all of you for your many kindnesses, including showing up today. And I want to thank the Caliphs and the Burks and Barbara Erbsman and Dick Martin and Sarah Lynn for their parts in helping me share my life in the tropics and other hotspots with all of you.
She would take some questions, but please wait for the microphone. Any questions? You've stunned us. You've absolutely awed us. Well, okay, we have a question here from Alvin.
As I understand, in Brazil, when the Brasilia, the capital, was established, a lot of the people who had been in Rio didn't want to go to the Brasilia city. They wanted to live in the city of Rio. Can you tell us a little about that period?
Well, you're absolutely right. Practically everyone who went to Brasilia went kicking and screaming. It was a place, there was a wonderful climate there, much better than in Rio. And the horizon was simply magnificent. Actually, we would not have been unhappy there, but most people wanted the bright lights of Rio, and they just did not want to move to that city. It also, interestingly, Brasilia was a difficult place for a family. This gorgeous city architecturally that Oscar Niemeyer had constructed was not made for people to walk in. And so you had, the avenues were enormous, like 10 lanes. A pedestrian would have been killed trying to get across the streets. Everybody was supposed to live in an apartment building, and the apartments didn't even have balconies because Niemeyer thought that if people, he knew Latin Americans very well and knew they'd hang their laundry out on the balcony. And he didn't want his gorgeous buildings spoiled by that, so no balconies. So it was very inhospitable for living. And I was really mad at him when one time when we were up there, we went there a fair amount, and our driver said, "Do you want to see Oscar Niemeyer's house?" And we said, "Oh, sure." So we drove around, and we come to this beautiful little Spanish hacienda type place, red tile roof, tropical, vegetation. It was absolutely beautiful. That's what he had built for himself. He just died, by the way.
Margaret, you not only have a really great story, but you have an incredible ability to tell the story in a fascinating way. We thank you.
Thank you.
You
That's so nice of you. Thank you.
You lived in Washington, and you were in governmental agencies in different places at a time when we had some really remarkable national leaders, and there was great respect, as you indicated in your relationships with these people, for our leaders. We live in a time of great cynicism about our political leaders. Well, from your perspective, as active as you've continued to be in politics, do you see any hopeful trend toward regaining respect for our national leaders and a more positive ability for our leaders to enact the legislation that really is necessary today?
Well, I hate to be so sad about it, but I see no possibility. Every time some politician who is a moderate or middle of the road or runs for office, he or she is defeated. I think there are voices like you, and certainly I would add mine to that, who long for the days when we all had heroes on both sides of the aisle. Our voices are simply too small, and the masses of people have been dragged in to vote at the extremes. I don't see any hope. I hope somebody else does, but I sure don't.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much, Margaret, for your talk. I enjoyed it immensely and brought back many memories from my own experiences. And I was just curious, in your understanding of Brazil, which I know is amazing, that did you have to read the book by William Bates, B-A-T-E-S, who was a British Victorian author who did the exploration of the Amazon?
No, I have not. Do you have a copy? He's a book dealer, so.
I fortunately sold my copy when I moved from Chicago, but it was an incredible work. He's the Victorian prose, and it talks about his experience of going up the Amazon. And then the other one is, are you familiar with the work of Anna Roosevelt in the Amazon?
No.
Because she did some very interesting work on primitive peoples about 15,000 years ago in the Amazon. And then it's taken up her great-grandfather was Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And so her work is kind of interesting, but like her great-grandfather, controversial, too.
Yes.
At the same time.
Well, talking about books, I have just finished reading a book I got from the Oakhammock Library. It's a biography of Abigail Adams. And I could not believe how similar her problems were as the wife of a politician, of an ambassador, of a president, and vice president, how similar her problems were to mine, or pleasures too. They weren't all problems, but I thought, oh my gosh, all these years and things haven't really changed. It's a wonderful book. It's back in the library if you want to take it out.
We have
Tara, how did your mother's activism influence your choice of your life's work?
I will say, I feel, I'll just say it's to have a mother who's so amazing. It's hard to follow in her footsteps. And I am much more like my father, who was more moderate and quiet. And so I never felt comfortable being the center of attention or out in front like my mom always did. I remember her pushing me to be in plays, and, for me to be on the stage in front of people was just not a comfortable place for me. But one thing that both my mom and dad definitely instilled in me is a need to have a job where I could be honest and transparent and ethical. And I am an attorney, but I've always been an attorney for a government. And I always felt really safe knowing that everything I was doing was subject to public records, that we were accountable to the public, and I work right now for the UF Foundation where, if we're not ethical, then we have no business doing what we're doing. I mean, I just feel, very, very responsible for making sure that our work is in compliance and ethical with the highest standards. So I would say that's what my mom and dad have passed on to us. I would not survive in a work environment that did not allow for that. So that's how I'd answer that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rick Gold. I was with the Foreign Service as well. I started in 1980, and I'd heard stories about the oppressive conditions of women working in the Foreign Service, and particularly requirements to retire if they married, plus women being graded for the degree to which they hosted their husbands and their Foreign Services parties, etc. I was wondering if your mom talked to you about that aspect of it and whether she was active in any way of changing these policies.
Well, that actually was the note while I was listening, I was thinking if there was something I wanted to comment on, and that is exactly what I wish to comment on. I noticed that she did not mention that she was forced to resign. She always had a great attitude. She always made the best of everything. As you might recall, when she was waiting for her Foreign Service appointment, she thought nothing of taking a typing test and working as a secretary. She just rolled with it. So we were aware that she was required to resign, that at the time the Foreign Service did not allow for two career couples. My sister and I'm 54 and she's about 3 years behind me. So we're right of the age where it matters to us a lot that our mother was required to resign just by virtue of being married. My mother was very, very social and loved a good party more than anybody. And so the social aspect of being my dad's wife actually came to her very naturally, and she loved it. So she was not one of the ones, as I would have felt if it had been me, she was not one of the ones who resented those duties. She actually embraced them. So I feel like she loved working and she loved hosting. And I do recall when my father retired, I recall family discussions that my mother thought about going back in. And at that time, the Foreign Service was embracing women who were coming back. Maybe embrace is too hard of a word, but there was definitely a path for women who had had to resign earlier to come back. And I remember my parents talking about whether or not my mom should go back in, meaning my daughter and I would be raised overseas, and I remember the decision being made that they would raise us here.
I'd like to add something to Rick's question. I worked for USAID. Actually, Rick and I worked for the same agency, but I started in '66, and the rule about women not having to resign when they married didn't change until '72. So I went through that. I actually turned down a proposal by saying I would have to quit my job, and I didn't want to do that. So that helped me in that particular case. But it was, interestingly, for people of that generation, it was accepted. We didn't challenge it. You know, everybody assumed they'd get married, and several people I went to through training with did in fact marry at that time. And then by '72, they had young children, and they weren't in a position to leave the children to go back to work. And the government didn't make it easy to go back to work because they said you can't be assigned where your husband will be, so you have to be prepared to, go somewhere else. And in fact, to this day, that is still the case. I'm having lunch today with a State Department couple whose parents live here, the Nicholsons, and she's going to be assigned in Pakistan and her husband's in Mali. So sometimes it's still pretty hard to be a tandem couple, at least in the State Department. But we have gone a long way since then, baby.
We have other questions or comments?
A question here is, when was this recorded? 2014.
2014.
I thought it was interesting that her comments about the future of politics were made 8 years ago.
Oh, I was too.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we've had a visit with Margaret, and it's been wonderful. And thank you, Tara, for being here. And thank all of you for your attendance today. So I think this brings our presentation to an end.
Thank you.